Sometimes what remains on the surface tells more than what is remembered. Old roads vanish into quiet fields. Towers lean over empty stations. The world above ground holds the shape of lives that once moved with purpose, now stilled by time and change. There is a sense of waiting here, a silence that stretches between what was built and what was left behind. This is the world of arc raiders. Its history unfolds across the remains of late industrial Earth, through the collapse that forced people below, and into the shadow of the arc machines. The timeline reaches from the last confident years before the fall, through the slow abandonment of the surface, to the long years underground. It moves between continents and settlements, from broken cities to the deep places where hope and routine still persist. Throughout there is a steady pressure, scarcity, distance, and the weight of uncertainty. Evidence of this pressure can be found in the empty spans of highways, the faded warnings on shelter doors, and the careful order of life beneath the ground. As we sit with these traces, there is no need to hurry. The world of arc raiders changes slowly now. Sounds will remain gentle and steady. Nothing will shift without warning. For a while, we can let the pace settle and stay with what endures. Before the arrival of the Ark, Earth's surface bore the signature of a world shaped by ambition and complexity. Across continents, remnants of sweeping infrastructure projects remain, their scale still visible in the silent bones of cities and the weathered lines of the landscape. During the pre-2100s era, major dams, power generation complexes, and energy facilities were constructed to harness natural forces and sustain industry and daily life. Even in ruin, these structures attest to a society capable of organizing vast resources and labor to reshape rivers, illuminate cities, and power machines. In valleys and along mountain rivers, the outlines of dam walls and power plant foundations trace the efforts of engineers and planners who sought stability and abundance for growing populations. Human aspiration in this era extended beyond the surface. Law materials reference spaceports and launch complexes, indicating sustained investment in orbital infrastructure. The remains of launch pads, control towers, and assembly hangars suggest coordinated efforts to maintain a presence beyond the atmosphere, a feat requiring advanced technology, logistical coordination, and political commitment. Scattered across remote plateaus and coastal plains, these facilities point to a period when spaceflight was an integrated component of global infrastructure. Urban planning reached a scale that remains legible in the organization of surface ruins. Towering buildings and interconnected complexes rise above once bustling districts, while streets, transit corridors, and public spaces reveal deliberate design. Residential, commercial, and industrial zones were clearly demarcated, supported by grid-like layouts, elevated roadways, and planned communal areas. The coherence of these metropolitan centers reflects long-term planning and centralized coordination, supported by extensive professional networks of architects, engineers, and civic authorities. Technological artifacts scattered throughout these environments offer further insight into the sophistication of pre-2100 society. Battered but legible signage and control panels reflect advanced materials and interface design. Automated systems for lighting, transportation, and resource management can be inferred from sensor arrays and control hubs embedded within city infrastructure. Surviving codex entries occasionally describe routine maintenance and full operational capacity prior to the Ark, suggesting a baseline of stability and technical competence. The organization of daily life is evident in the spatial arrangement of civilian and industrial districts. Clustered housing blocks and shared green spaces indicate structured residential planning, while storefronts and market halls mark former centers of commerce and social exchange. Industrial zones, set apart by wide avenues and loading docks, housed factories, warehouses, and logistical centers essential to a complex economy. The placement of these districts reflects an effort to balance production with the rhythms of everyday life. Transportation networks stitched these settlements together. Cracked highways and faint rail lines trace major transit corridors that once connected urban centers to outlying installations and resource hubs. Stations, depots, and transfer points underscore the importance of coordinated movement for people and goods. The durability and scale of these routes indicate systems engineered for sustained commercial and industrial use, rather than short-term expansion. Industrial facilities dotted the broader landscape, their purposes discernible through machinery layouts and storage infrastructure. Warehouses with reinforced loading bays served as distribution centers, while factories processed resources at scale to supply local and regional markets. Many sites were positioned near transport routes or energy sources, reflecting careful planning for efficiency and access. Environmental storytelling preserves traces of corporate and civic involvement through faded logos, branded containers, and institutional emblems, even as operational details have been lost. Public life is further illuminated by preserved signage, advertisements, and notices found in sheltered corridors and entryways. These remnants reference health initiatives, cultural events, and commercial activity, offering glimpses into societal priorities. In rare instances, codex excerpts name individuals or groups associated with civic projects or industrial milestones, providing direct but fragmentary connections to the people who shaped this world. Alongside these achievements, signs of strain were already present. Corrosion of metalwork, crumbling concrete, and polluted waterways reveal environmental wear that began before the Ark era. Power lines sag, streets buckle, and water channels clog with sediment, indicating challenges in maintenance and resource allocation within increasingly complex systems. In several locations, incomplete defensive structures remain visible. Barriers, bunkers, and warning systems line the edges of urban and industrial zones, many left unfinished. Their presence suggests awareness of potential threats, while their partial implementation reflects uncertainty or limits in collective response. Emergency infrastructure adds another layer to this picture. Shelters, evacuation routes, and safety signage appear unevenly across cities. Some districts show careful preparation, while others reveal gaps in planning or execution. Codex references to emergency agencies exist, though their coordination and effectiveness remain unclear. Evidence of infrastructure failure and resource shortages appears both in documentation and in the landscape itself. Codex materials mention power disruptions, water rationing, and logistical bottlenecks, mirrored by stalled projects and derelict facilities. These conditions point to mounting pressure on systems designed to support an ambitious world. Public advisories preserved in notices and codex excerpts reflect awareness of these vulnerabilities. Warnings about pollution, appeals for conservation, and emergency guidance reveal a population conscious of its dependence on interconnected systems and the risks of their failure. Taken together, the ruins, documentation, and environmental traces establish a clear portrait of Earth before the Ark. The pre-2100s world was defined by technological reach and coordinated ambition, yet marked by emerging fragility within the systems that sustained it. In abandoned cities, and beneath silent megastructures, the record of that balance remains, preserved in the structures left behind. In the early decades of the 22nd century, the surface of the Earth underwent a transformation both violent and absolute. The collapse, as recorded in codex entries and environmental records, unfolded through a succession of catastrophic events. Vast floods swept across continents, submerging entire cities and leaving behind waterlogged wastelands. Earthquakes fractured highways, toppled towers, and reduced neighborhoods to unstable rubble. Scorching fires followed, consuming forests, fields, and what remained of urban centers. The evidence of these calamities endures in the landscape itself: drowned buildings rising from floodplains, bridges ending abruptly in open air, and the blackened remains of structures scorched beyond recognition. In the aftermath, the remnants of built environments stretched across the surface. Overgrown ruins, advanced unchecked, as nature reclaimed abandoned streets and plazas. Ivy climbed the walls of shattered hospitals and schools, while roots split pavement and forced their way through the cracked floors of government buildings. The port city of Murano, once a hub of commerce, became a silent monument to the past, its architecture gradually buried beneath shifting sand dunes in what came to be known as the Rust Belt. Preserved by the encroaching sands, the city offered a frozen glimpse into the moment civilization failed. Infrastructure collapse accelerated the breakdown of surface life. Power grids failed under physical damage and environmental stress. Dams burst or crumbled, unleashing torrents that erased entire districts. Bridges were twisted, submerged, or swept away, severing regional connections. Public facilities stood deserted or in ruin, their interiors exposed to wind and encroaching plant life. No record survives of any organization maintaining a sustained response during the early 2100s. The scale and speed of the collapse overwhelmed every existing system. As conditions deteriorated, hazards rendered much of the surface uninhabitable. Toxic zones formed where chemical spills and industrial debris mixed with floodwaters. Landslides destabilized hillsides, cutting off escape routes and burying communities. In certain areas, radiation from damaged facilities lingered, creating invisible boundaries survivors learned to avoid. Although the Codex preserves few personal accounts from this period, the evidence left behind, abandoned belongings, barricaded doors, and improvised warning signs, speaks to widespread fear and uncertainty. The breakdown of infrastructure triggered the collapse of supply chains and trade routes. With roads impassable and fuel supplies dwindling, the movement of goods ceased. Distribution networks that once provided food, medicine, and essential materials failed entirely. Abandoned vehicles lined empty highways, their cargoes looted or left to decay. Logistical hubs stood open to the elements, their former purpose erased by the new conditions. In the remaining habitable zones, survivors gathered in makeshift communities. Codex records describe small tribes forming around freshwater sources or within the most stable ruins. Barriers were erected to keep out environmental hazards and rival groups. For a brief period, a fragile form of surface life persisted through shared resources, scavenging, and mutual protection. These efforts were short-lived. Scarcity intensified, and competition for food, water, and shelter grew increasingly desperate. Conflict soon defined surface existence. Disputes over territory and supplies escalated into violence, fragmenting survivor groups further. Makeshift barricades and improvised weapons marked the boundaries between rival factions. Attempts to restore basic services, such as food distribution, medical care, or communication, were sporadic and unsustainable. Environmental hazards and the collapse of trust prevented any lasting stability from taking hold. Signs of displacement spread across the landscape. Trails of discarded belongings marked the movement of refugee groups. Temporary shelters appeared at the edges of habitable zones, only to be abandoned as conditions worsened or conflict erupted. Though no detailed records name those responsible for logistics or relief, physical traces remain: supply caches hidden in ruins, handwritten warnings on walls, and the remains of communal fires surrounded by broken tools. Eventually it became clear that long-term life on the surface could not continue. Environmental devastation, infrastructural collapse, and social fragmentation left no safe refuge above ground. Records indicate that survivors were forced underground, seeking shelter in places such as the makeshift community of Speranza. Machines patrolled abandoned streets, further deterring any attempt to remain on the surface. The transition underground unfolded gradually. Initial refuge was sought in caves, basements, and tunnels. Over time, these spaces were reinforced and organized, their entrances sealed or fortified against hazards and intrusion. Evidence of hurried departure remains visible. Half-packed suitcases, abandoned vehicles clustered near tunnel entrances, and personal items left behind in haste. No record identifies a specific government body or individual coordinating this movement during the early 2100s. The decision to abandon the surface appears to have arisen from necessity, rather than centralized planning. Communities reinforced underground entrances with scavenged materials, creating barriers against both environmental threats and other survivors. Entire populations disappeared below ground, leaving only fragments of their existence behind. Codex materials preserve no direct testimony explaining the abandonment, but the physical evidence conveys urgency and resignation. The surface was no longer survivable. Generations after the collapse, human life endured only underground, sustained by memory, salvage, and rare perilous expeditions above. By the early 2100s, the transformation was complete. The surface stood silent, shaped by flood, fire, and neglect, reclaimed slowly by nature and watched over by unfeeling machines. Below ground, survivors gathered in confined communities, marking the end of one epoch and the uncertain beginning of another. In the mid-22nd century, the world experienced a profound and irrevocable transformation. The event known as the Exodus marked a watershed moment in human history, when a significant portion of humanity departed Earth for distant colonies. Surviving documentation, environmental traces, and collective memory confirm that this was a deliberate and coordinated undertaking, not a chaotic flight or later embellishment. The Exodus stands as a structured removal of people from the planet, carried out through organized systems of access and control. Community records refer explicitly to the Exodus as a mass departure facilitated by those with wealth and influence. These sources describe a managed process rather than an improvised escape. Infrastructure supporting the migration was monumental and highly visible. At the Escalation spaceport, launch towers dominated the landscape, built solely to send shuttles beyond the atmosphere. Eyewitness observations describe crowds gathering as the shuttles departed, their engines igniting and their flames narrowing into distant points before vanishing entirely. Private enterprise played a central role in enabling the Exodus. The Unanswered company offered space travel during this period, but passage was restricted to those who could afford it. A surviving J. Cosma Ventures billboard from 2082 captures this reality with stark clarity. Humanity, our most valuable shipment. The phrase reflects how evacuation was framed as a logistical operation, with people treated as cargo to be transported, rather than a population to be preserved. The process was neither open nor comprehensive. No surviving ledger records who left or where they ultimately went. What remains is the memory of departure itself and the absence that followed. The lack of documentation underscores the exclusivity of the event and the secrecy surrounding its execution. What was visible were the launch towers, the departing shuttles, and the permanence of separation they represented. No individual testimonies from the departing population survive, but the environment bears unmistakable witness. Abandoned launch towers and defunct shuttles at Escalation remain fixed in place, designed for a single purpose, and left behind once that purpose was fulfilled. In scattered dialogue among those who remained, the Exodus is remembered not as distant history, but as a defining rupture, marked by the final sight of engines burning skyward. The Exodus divided humanity along clear lines. Codex entries and community records describe eligibility determined by wealth, social standing, and political leverage. Cosma tickets could be purchased or secured through influence, while the majority were excluded by circumstance. This division was not accidental. It reflected deliberate decisions made by pre-Exodus factions who controlled access to departure. The social consequences were immediate and enduring. Families and communities fractured as individuals were separated by eligibility criteria. Surviving accounts reference resentment, confusion, and a sense of betrayal among those left behind. The language used in records and advertisements reinforced this divide, framing evacuees as valuable assets while implicitly abandoning the rest of the population to worsening conditions on Earth. Economic and social privilege shaped the demographic outcome of the Exodus. Those who departed represented a narrow segment of humanity, while the remaining majority faced environmental collapse with dwindling resources. The event is not remembered as a rescue, but as a transaction driven by access and means. This imbalance altered the structure of surface societies, leaving gaps in labor, leadership, and institutional continuity. The aftermath is visible across the landscape. At Asera, launch towers still rise above the haze, unused and silent. Remaining shuttles lie among the ruins, physical remnants of the mass departure. Elsewhere, infrastructure once maintained by a larger population stands abandoned or repurposed. Regions such as the Rust Belt show signs of accelerated decline, shaped by both environmental fallout and human absence. Survivors adapted by reusing what remained. Environmental storytelling documents the repurposing of abandoned structures and salvage technology as communities reorganized under new constraints. Former launch sites and industrial facilities became landmarks, serving as reference points in a world reshaped by loss and endurance. There are no records naming individuals who engaged directly with these remnants in the immediate aftermath, but the collective response is evident. Communities drew on abandoned infrastructure to survive, reorganizing in the shadow of departure. The absence of those who left created both hardship and space for adaptation, forcing new strategies in a world already under strain. The long-term implications of the Exodus are written into the surface itself. Launch towers, empty shuttles, and altered settlements testify to the scale of the event and the resilience of those who remained. These traces preserve the memory of a world divided, where privilege determined escape and survival required endurance. As the mid-2100s drew to a close, the nature of the Exodus was beyond dispute. It was a coordinated and monumental departure that reshaped humanity. The division it created persisted, visible in the remnants scattered across the surface, and in the societies that endured below. The story of the Exodus remains preserved not as legend, but as lived history, fixed in steel, ruin, and memory. In the late 21st century, the world's battered surface bore witness to a new and unfamiliar phenomenon. Long after environmental collapse had reshaped cities, forests, and farmlands, a different threat began to assert itself. Codex entries and scattered records describe a sky no longer defined solely by pollution or dust, but occasionally streaked with descending machines. These crude forms fell from the heavens into the Rust Belt, marking the first documented presence of arc machines on Earth. The earliest evidence of these incursions comes from survivors living in makeshift communities and loosely connected tribes. Their accounts, preserved in codex entries and environmental markers, identify this period as the first wave. The machines known as barons emerged as the most recognizable element of this new threat. Distinct in form and function, they left lasting impressions on the landscape. Years later, their rusted husks could still be found scattered across maps, silent markers of the Ark's initial arrival. Encounters were not limited to isolated individuals. Raider groups, already accustomed to defending territory against human rivals and environmental hazards, soon found themselves facing an adversary that did not behave like any before. Raider documentation records direct confrontations with Ark machines, noting their patrol patterns and mechanical persistence. Barons moved with purpose, indifferent to the ruined world and unresponsive to human presence. The arrival of Ark machines altered daily reality on the surface. Fallen machines and wreckage became part of the environment, their presence shaping movement and memory. Early encounters produced confusion and fear, forcing survivors to reassess long-held survival strategies. What had once been a struggle against instability and decay now included a deliberate mobile threat. The consequences of the first wave were immediate. Arky attacks devastated communities already weakened by collapse. In the Rust Belt, where both ruins and human populations were dense, the impact was especially severe. Makeshift shelters were destroyed or abandoned, and casualties mounted as survivors struggled to understand and counter the machines. Raiders adapted out of necessity. Previous conflicts with rival groups or environmental dangers offered little preparation for an enemy that neither negotiated nor retreated. Over time, raider bands formed larger alliances, pooling knowledge and manpower. Records indicate that resistance was not ideological, but practical. Communities were forced to confront or flee, as avoidance became increasingly difficult. A defining moment came with the Battle of Victory Ridge, a rocky outcrop west of the Alcantara Dam. Documented in raider logs and environmental evidence, the battle marked a coordinated effort to halt Ark advance in the region. Raiders unified their tactics and mounted a sustained defense. While details of individual maneuvers are limited, the outcome is clear. The last known Baron in the Rust Belt was defeated, bringing a temporary halt to Ark dominance in the area. In the aftermath, surface life adjusted again. Security became central to survival. Communities invested in watch patrols, warning systems, and defensive structures. Some groups studied Ark behavior, searching for patterns that might allow avoidance or resistance. Others relocated, abandoning contested ground entirely. The wreckage of Barons served as both warning and proof that resistance carried a cost. Attempts to interact with Ark machines failed consistently. Codex entries record no successful negotiations or alliances. Ark responses were uniform and aggressive, reinforcing the understanding that the machines operated according to their own imperatives. Efforts to evade or mislead them often ended in loss. No central authority emerged to coordinate resistance. Responses remained localized, shaped by available resources and immediate threats. Even so, shared experience fostered cooperation. Information and tactics spread across regions, linking otherwise isolated groups through necessity. As the decade progressed, the character of the world shifted. Environmental collapse remained visible, but it no longer defined the primary danger. Instead, Ark patrols and the scars of machine conflict reshaped priorities. The surface became a contested space, its risks measured less by natural decay and more by mechanical movement. The defeat at Victory Ridge offered a brief reprieve. Raider groups experienced a short period of relative stability, marked by the presence of ruined barons left where they fell. These remains stood as evidence that the balance of power had momentarily shifted. Yet the broader transformation was unmistakable. Arky machines altered infrastructure, travel routes, and access to resources. Survivors adapted their movements to avoid patrols, shaping new patterns of settlement and survival. The influence of the machines was felt not only in their presence, but in the decisions they forced upon those who remained. By the end of the late 21st century, the first wave had introduced a new era. The struggle for survival was no longer defined solely by environmental collapse, but by persistent mechanical incursion. The world carried the memory of chaos that came before, now joined by the steady, deliberate pressure of Ark dominance. In the late 21st century, the world above ground no longer offered safety. As the second wave of Ark intensified, survivors were forced to abandon surface life and retreat underground. This was not a gradual migration, but a rapid withdrawal, driven by necessity. Groups converged on the remains of old cities, searching for any structure that could be adapted for shelter. Among these, the emergence of Speranza marked a turning point. What began as a makeshift refuge during the chaos of the second Ark wave quickly expanded into a nucleus of subterranean life, its corridors filled with constant activity as people adapted under pressure. Engineering challenges defined the earliest phase. With little time to plan, survivors reinforced basements, subway stations, and maintenance tunnels using scavenged materials. New passageways were carved into the earth with salvaged machinery, while elevators and access shafts were constructed to move people and supplies between levels. In some areas, entire sunken districts were repurposed, their skeletal structures stabilized with steel and concrete. The underground network expanded rapidly, branching into a dense system of tunnels and chambers shaped by urgency rather than design. Scarcity was immediate and persistent. Resources were limited, and every system competed for attention. Walls needed reinforcement, ventilation had to be maintained, and artificial lighting installed, all while food, water, and medical supplies ran short. Supply lines that reached back to the surface were dangerous and unreliable. Rationing became routine, and disputes over distribution were common. Every inhabitant understood that the failure of a single system could endanger thousands. Despite these pressures, coordination began to emerge. The establishment of Toledo as the primary underground city brought a degree of structure to the growing network. Within it, Speranza, sometimes referred to as Speranza, became the focal point for new arrivals. Records note Celeste and a small group of others assuming leadership roles, not through formal authority, but through their ability to organize labor and resolve disputes. Construction teams formed from whoever could work, and expansion continued relentlessly as population increased. By the end of this period, the foundations of subterranean life were in place. Tunnels linked settlements at varying depths, some wide enough for groups to pass, others narrow and confined. Elevators, ladders, and improvised transport systems allowed movement through the network. Toledo sprawled beneath the surface, defined by the reach of its tunnels and the endurance of its people. Built in haste, it required constant maintenance, but offered a measure of stability. Social organization adapted to the realities below ground. Surface hierarchies lost relevance, replaced by practical governance. Leadership emerged from those who could manage resources, mediate conflict, or solve urgent problems. Informal councils handled rationing, labor coordination, and security. These structures were fragile, challenged continually by scarcity and confinement, but they provided a framework for cooperation. Daily life settled into communal routines. Shared quarters, collective meals, and rotating chores became the norm. Rules governing noise, movement, and resource use developed through collective agreement and necessity. Cooperation was essential, yet conflict remained close at hand. Limited supplies and close quarters magnified disagreements, occasionally erupting into violence. Survival demanded compromise, even as tensions simmered. Over time, some stability took hold. Systems such as the slingshot tube network improved mobility within the underground, enabling faster movement of people and resources. Informal councils gained recognition through consistent action. Leadership was earned through trust and reliability, rather than mandate. Psychological strain was an inescapable part of subterranean life. The absence of natural light, constant proximity to others, and awareness of danger above weighed heavily on the population. Anxiety and stress were common, especially among adults who remembered life on the surface. The need to send expeditions topside for essential goods compounded this strain. Cultural adaptation followed. Songs, stories, and murals emerged that reflected the journey underground and the struggle to endure. Communal gatherings offered moments of relief, while some individuals withdrew into isolation. The meaning of home shifted, no longer tied to open spaces or sunlight, but to tunnels, shared effort, and mutual dependence. Generational differences became apparent. Older inhabitants spoke of the surface with nostalgia, their memories both comforting and painful. Younger generations, raised underground, viewed the surface as distant and dangerous. Their identities were shaped by confinement and cooperation rather than loss. By the end of the late 21st century, life underground was no longer considered temporary. The retreat below had become the foundation of a new existence. Communities such as Toledo and Speranza endured through adaptation, resilience, and the constant negotiation of scarcity. In the darkness beneath the earth, humanity reshaped itself, sustaining life through collective effort and the determination to persist. Beneath the fractured surface of the Rust Belt, Speranza stands as the principal refuge for those who endure. Carved into a network of tunnels and chambers, the settlement exists by design and necessity, shaped by the demands of survival rather than by grand intention. In the early years of the 23rd century, Speranza functions as the central hub of underground life in the region, sustained through routine, coordination, and communal vigilance. The main hub forms the core of this activity. A broad open square lit by electric lanterns, it bears the marks of constant passage and exchange. Raiders gather here to review maps, assemble teams, and prepare for expeditions to the surface. Bulletin boards list available missions, while digital displays track ongoing feats. The space is practical, rather than ceremonial, designed to support coordination rather than spectacle. Speranza's depth provides protection from Arca machines, allowing a rare measure of stability. Within the tunnels, the absence of immediate external threat enables focus on survival tasks instead of constant defense. Security within the settlement is maintained through routine oversight rather than fortification. Shani, known for her vigilance, manages public order while trading binoculars and raider hatch keys in exchange for cred, reinforcing the balance between safety and commerce. Craft and trade converge in the workshop, which serves as the settlement's manufacturing center. Salvaged materials brought back from the surface, metal, circuitry, and damaged machinery are transformed into weapons, tools, and gadgets. Blueprints guide production, while collaborative labor ensures efficiency. Traders anchor this system. Tianwen supplies ammunition and weapons, Apollo specializes in quick-use items, and Lance provides medical equipment essential for survival. Economic exchange is continuous. Cred functions as the primary medium, earned through missions and feats, then spent on gear, supplies, and services. Raiders accept contracts, sell salvage, and establish raider dens within the settlement. While barter persists, formal exchange provides structure to daily transactions. Records from this period consistently identify Speranza as the dominant center for population and resource coordination underground. Storage and preparation are handled through the stash system, which secures items recovered from surface operations. The default capacity of 64 slots can be expanded to accommodate long-term accumulation, reflecting the gradual stabilization of resource management. This system reduces loss and supports planning for future expeditions. Social organization emerges through roles rather than hierarchy. Traders, medics, organizers, and raiders each occupy defined niches. Raider dens provide modest personal space, a cot, sparse decoration, and basic functionality, serving as sites for rest, maintenance, and skill development. Within these confines, individuals adapt their capabilities to support both personal survival and group needs. Resource management remains a shared responsibility. Joint crafting projects and pooled salvage foster cooperation, reinforcing mutual dependence. Decisions about allocation are guided by practicality rather than authority, shaped by immediate needs and available materials. Daily routines follow a steady cycle. Expeditions are planned in the main hub, equipment prepared and repaired in the workshop, and resources redistributed upon return. Gear maintenance is constant, as exposure to the surface takes its toll. This rhythm, planning, action, repair, and rest, defines life in Speranza. Communal interaction extends beyond work. Residents exchange information, share news, and offer support within the main hub. Camaraderie develops through shared effort, rather than formal institution. Values of resilience and mutual aid are reinforced through repetition and necessity. Constraints are ever present. Salvage is finite, overcrowding persists, and privacy is limited. The basic conditions of life, cramped quarters, modest comforts, constant preparation, serve as reminders of the settlement's limits. Safety ends at the tunnel exits, and every surface mission carries risk. Health and morale are shaped by routine and cooperation. Periods of calm exist within Speranza's safe confines, but survival demands remain unrelenting. Setbacks are met with adaptation rather than despair. The community endures through incremental success rather than decisive victory. There are no declarations of destiny in the records of Speranza's early years. Survival is maintained through steady effort, repaired tools, completed trades, and successful returns. The settlement persists not through dramatic acts, but through continuity. As the early 2200s unfold, Speranza remains the focal point of underground human society in the region. Its tunnels and chambers record a way of life built on cooperation, adaptation, and persistence. In the quiet beneath the surface, the community continues, shaping each day from the resources at hand. In the early years of the 23rd century, raiders began to describe their era as the Second Wave. The term appeared consistently in logs, codex entries, and spoken warnings exchanged before surface operations. It reflected a clear shift. Where earlier Ark incursions relied on relatively predictable machines, this new phase introduced units that moved with coordination and apparent adaptation. Raiders who had survived the first wave recognized the change immediately. Among the new machines were barons and queens, distinct in design and capability, marking a departure from earlier Ark forms. Records from this period describe a surface environment transformed by persistent threat. Raiders documented how even brief excursions carried severe risk. Ark units coordinated patrols, laid traps, and responded rapidly to intrusion. The surface was no longer a place for measured scavenging. It became a contested zone where every movement risked detection. Environmental observations reinforced this shift. Streets and ruins once silent were now patrolled in organized patterns. Mapping efforts revealed changes in Ark movement, with previously accessible areas becoming heavily monitored. Discussions within the Speranza underground base consistently reference the second wave to distinguish this sustained escalation from earlier encounters. Human organizations responded by formally acknowledging the threat. Meeting notes and directives issued warnings that named the new machines explicitly. Barons and queens became shorthand for encounters that could not be managed with previous tactics. Records from security officers and raider captains convey the recognition that established methods were no longer sufficient. Arc activity also altered the relationship between surface and underground life. Access points to the surface became increasingly dangerous. Arc patrols operated as interconnected systems, calling reinforcements when contact occurred. Raiders reported that even brief exposure could trigger rapid convergence of machine units, forcing retreat or resulting in heavy losses. Surface access relied on elevators and metro stations linking underground shelters to the ruins above. Over time, these exits became unreliable, governed by staggered availability that reduced options as missions progressed. Raider hatches offered alternative extraction routes, but required keys to operate. Securing these keys carried its own risks, as Arc drones patrolled nearby areas and emitted alarms that initiated pursuit. The threat extended below ground. Security logs recorded attempted Arc breaches into underground facilities, including Speranza. In response, human communities strengthened internal defenses. Patrols increased, sentries were posted at access points, and emergency procedures became routine. Surface expeditions grew less frequent, and their cost rose steadily. Settlement patterns shifted under this pressure. Some underground communities consolidated, abandoning peripheral tunnels to concentrate resources. Others attempted to establish temporary surface outposts, seeking controlled access points. These efforts met mixed success, often drawing Arc attention and resulting in conflict. Resource recovery became increasingly difficult. Salvaged materials were deposited at field delivery points designed to transport Arc field crates safely underground. Each successful delivery was critical. In underground workshops, recovered components were transformed into weapons, armor, and tools. Raiders repaired damaged equipment and integrated Arc technology into new designs, improving their capabilities even as challenges intensified. Logistical strain prompted debate among leadership. Meetings at Speranza addressed resource allocation, mission priorities, and acceptable risk. Some advocated caution, emphasizing preservation of life and supplies. Others pushed for aggressive action to disrupt Arc patrols. Records reflect ongoing disagreement, shaped by uncertainty and the absence of definitive solutions. Morale fluctuated with each mission. Raiders returning from the surface shared accounts of narrow escapes and losses, reinforcing both solidarity and anxiety. The underground community grew more cohesive, even as awareness of the threat above deepened. Adaptation became essential. Raiders developed new skills, upgraded equipment, and refined tactics. Speranza evolved into a planning hub, where teams coordinated, traded, and prepared for increasingly dangerous operations. Survival depended on continuous innovation. By the early 2200s, the second wave was recognized as a distinct era. Changes in Arc behavior, the introduction of new machines, and sustained pressure on surface and underground communities marked a profound shift. Human survival strategies evolved in response, shaped by constant threat and the need for resilience in a world transformed. In the years following the second wave, underground settlements, such as Speranza, became the primary refuge for human survival. These communities offered shelter, but little security from deprivation. By the early to mid-22nd century, records document persistent shortages of food, water, medical supplies, and replacement parts for life support systems. Emergency stockpiles assembled during earlier phases proved insufficient for growing populations, and many essential components could not be reproduced underground. These limitations shaped daily life and forced difficult decisions within each settlement. With the surface under Arca control, external supply chains ceased entirely. Administrative records note the absence of trade or outside aid. Survival depended on retrieving materials from the ruins above. Leadership councils weighed the risks of surface expeditions against the certainty of decline below ground. Despite disagreement over exposure and loss, the conclusion was consistent across records. Without surface recovery, settlements would fail. The hazards awaiting surface teams were well documented. Environmental instability, combined with persistent Ark patrols, made every mission uncertain. Observers reported unpredictable terrain, shifting debris, and the constant presence of machines such as deforesters and barons. Expeditions required stealth, planning, and rapid adaptation. The danger was understood not as an abstract threat, but as a calculated risk taken to sustain life underground. Organization of surface operations fell to local leadership councils. Decisions were decentralized, focused on prioritizing needs and selecting personnel. In Speranza, logs describe selection based on physical capability, technical skill, and prior experience. While objections were recorded, the necessity of surface recovery was treated as settled reality, rather than debate. Those chosen for surface work became known as raiders. Their routines were shaped by training, preparation, and adaptation. Equipment was assembled from salvaged parts and modified Ark components. Technical logs describe tools such as signal jammers, sensor cloaks, and compact energy weapons developed through experimentation. Raiders studied Ark patrol patterns, identifying weaknesses and maintenance cycles to exploit. Losses were frequent. Records include detailed accounts of failed expeditions and casualties. Some teams never returned, others succeeded at high cost. Victory Ridge emerged as a focal point of prolonged engagement, valued for its remaining industrial materials. Over years of conflict, raiders adapted their tactics, using terrain and deception to offset Ark advantages. Success was temporary and required constant revision as Ark patrols adjusted. Operational protocols evolved through experience. Codex entries outline team roles, communication standards, and extraction procedures. Raiders worked in small, specialized units to reduce exposure. Reverse-engineered Ark technology was incorporated to disrupt machine targeting and conceal human activity. These methods reflected continuous learning rather than static doctrine. Within underground settlements, the raider role became formalized. Administrative records identify raiders as a distinct group, integral to survival. Resources they recovered were inventoried and distributed through established procedures. Councils oversaw allocation based on urgency, often acknowledging the risks taken to secure critical supplies. Tension accompanied this role. Some records note disputes over resource distribution and concerns that raider activity increased Ark attention. Debates over priority and risk were common, but rarely resolved. Despite criticism, the necessity of raiders was consistently affirmed in official accounts. Over time, informal codes of conduct emerged among raiders, emphasizing reliability, mutual support, and accountability. Experienced raiders served as advisors, contributing to planning and security. Their knowledge influenced broader settlement strategy. The presence of raiders shaped morale. Anxiety followed failed missions. Relief accompanied successful returns. Their actions became central to the rhythm of underground life, linking surface danger to subterranean survival. By the early to mid-22nd century, raiders were fully integrated into the economic and social systems of settlements, like Speranza. Their practices, protocols, and lessons formed part of institutional memory. Through risk and adaptation, raiders embodied the resilience required to endure in a world defined by scarcity and persistent threat. Across the surface regions of Ark raiders, the landscape functions as a record of past events. Industrial ruins, silent dams, and fractured infrastructure preserve evidence of ambition, conflict, and adaptation. In the present era, these sites are not passive backdrops, but enduring markers that shape movement, strategy, and memory. By observing these locations, survivors trace how earlier choices continue to influence daily life. The Alcantara power plant, known as the Dam, dominates the dam battlegrounds as a relic of pre-collapse ambition. Rising above toxic lowlands, its concrete mass remains a focal point of activity. Raider camps and small settlements cluster around its perimeter, drawn by shelter and strategic advantage. The structure bears visible damage: cracked spillways, corroded supports, and scarred surfaces, marking it as a former stronghold and a continuing site of conflict. Arky skirmishes persist in its shadow, underscoring the dam's lasting importance. Within the dam battlegrounds, the control tower and research administration building remain intact enough to navigate. Loot seekers move through these spaces cautiously, searching for resources among remnants of administrative order. Faded signage and markings provide limited insight into the site's original function, anchoring its present use in its past purpose. Beyond the dam, interconnected industrial ruins stretch across accessible regions. Service roads and utility corridors link collapsed facilities, forming routes now used by raiders and scavengers. In mountainous areas, tunnels and underground complexes persist near former industrial sites, offering shelter and concealment. These structures testify to the scale of earlier development and the continued value of subterranean space. Use of these sites varies. Some settlements take advantage of the protection offered by concrete and steel, while raider camps exploit complex layouts for defense. Other areas are avoided due to instability, toxic conditions, or histories of violence. Although records do not name specific organizations responsible for these sites, the coordinated nature of their construction remains evident. Observers often interpret these environments as historical evidence. Structural damage aligns with known engagements, and debris patterns reflect past conflicts. In this way, the landscape preserves memory through material trace rather than written record. Urban remnants extend this record. The buried city, largely concealed beneath shifting sand, reveals fragments of former streets and structures. Subterranean corridors beneath the dunes allow passage through layered remains, marked by graffiti, signage, and abandoned belongings. These traces offer glimpses of daily life interrupted by abrupt change. Smaller towns dot open regions, their layouts still recognizable despite abandonment. Some serve as temporary refuges or way stations for raiders, while others remain empty. The Acera spaceport stands apart in scale. Its runways and hangars, designed for space travel, remain intact but unused, reflecting ambitions no longer attainable. Stella Montis, an isolated research facility in snow-covered terrain, adds another dimension. Largely untouched, its arrangement suggests specialized purpose without preserving full context. Together with empty transit corridors and buried districts, it reinforces the pattern of rapid abandonment that followed earlier upheavals. Artifacts scattered across these regions, signs, tools, and markings, offer insight into former routines and responses to crisis. Some are avoided, others repurposed. Raiders move through abandoned corridors for cover, establish camps within ruined neighborhoods, and adapt remnants to present needs. The Ark's presence is embedded throughout the environment. In the down battlegrounds, skirmishes shape movement and settlement. The husk graveyard, filled with inert Ark remains, marks sites of past conflict. These machine remnants serve as both warning and opportunity, guiding raider behavior. Certain areas produce unexpected effects. At the practice range, Arker disorientation creates pockets of reduced threat. Environmental modifiers, such as electromagnetic storms, alter machine behavior and terrain conditions, introducing variability and risk. Visual markers of Ark influence, warning signs, altered terrain, machine silhouettes, shape human patterns of avoidance and engagement. Some groups settle where Ark presence is lighter. Others specialize in navigating contested zones. Though formal records rarely attribute these responses to named individuals or institutions, collective adaptation is evident. Settlement patterns and raider tactics reflect ongoing negotiation with a landscape transformed by machines. Through its industrial ruins, urban remnants, and Arkle-altered terrain, the surface reveals itself as a layered archive. Each site preserves a distinct chapter of change. By reading these environments, survivors gain not only tactical understanding, but insight into a world shaped by ambition, disruption, and adaptation. In the world shaped by the Ark and the Exodus, knowledge is organized with care and caution. According to the World Book Codex, survivors categorize their understanding of the past and present into history, people, Toledo, Ark, and topside. These categories provide structure, but they also reflect limitation. Much of what existed before the Exodus is no longer accessible. What remains consists of fragments, damaged records, scattered artifacts, and the memories of a small number of elders who lived through earlier eras. Their recollections are valuable, but incomplete, shaped by time and upheaval. The launch towers stand as prominent reminders of this loss. They mark the end of a period remembered only in part, described in the Codex as an era of extraordinary technological capability. The towers themselves remain visible and intact, yet the systems that enabled their use are no longer understood. Survivors can observe their scale and speculate about their function, but the technical knowledge behind them has not survived. The period following the Exodus, referred to as the Sunrise, is similarly fragmentary. Records describe it as brief and transitional, marked by attempts at recovery and adaptation. Documentation from this phase is limited, leaving gaps in understanding how survivors reorganized and what knowledge was reclaimed or lost. The Sunrise occupies an uncertain position between collapse and concealment, remembered but not fully documented. These gaps are acknowledged openly in surviving materials. The Codex does not claim completeness. Instead, it reflects a provisional understanding shaped by what could be preserved or reconstructed. This uncertainty influences how survivors interpret the past and approach the present. Certain groups have assumed responsibility for maintaining what knowledge remains. The Codex itself compiles existing records and incorporates new findings. Those who venture topside serve as both scavengers and archivists, returning with artifacts and observations for evaluation. Each discovery is compared against existing accounts, sometimes confirming long-held beliefs and sometimes raising new questions. Several core mysteries persist. The origin of the space technology that enabled the Exodus is undocumented. Records hint at complexity beyond surviving explanations, but provide no definitive account of its development or creators. The question of whether this technology was entirely human-made remains unresolved. The nature and purpose of the Archi machines are equally unclear. The first wave arrived without warning, and later waves forced humanity underground. Observations and recovered components reveal aspects of Ark behavior, but their objectives and origins remain unknown. Whether the machines are capable of further adaptation beyond observed patterns is not established. Uncertainty also surrounds the selection process for the Exodus. Surviving records do not fully explain how eligibility was determined, or why some were granted passage, while others were left behind. These gaps influence how survivors understand lineage, legitimacy, and loss. Investigations into these questions continue. Expeditions to old sites are organized not only for survival but for discovery. Salvaging is recognized as a method of inquiry, as well as necessity. Competing interpretations circulate among survivor groups, reflecting active engagement with unresolved history. This uncertainty shapes daily decisions. Choices about where to scavenge, how to respond to Ark activity, and whom to trust are informed by incomplete knowledge. Caution and curiosity coexist, guiding both individual behavior and group policy. The present era is understood as an unfinished chapter. Documentation of current events is ongoing, recorded through codex entries that track actions and outcomes in real time. These records form a living archive, growing with each operation, success or failure. There are no declarations that claim final understanding. Instead, the emphasis remains on careful observation and record keeping. Survivors recognize that certainty, once believed permanent, has proven fragile. Through this approach, the boundaries of knowledge are slowly tested. Each artifact recovered, each observation recorded, adds to a collective effort to understand a world still shaped by unanswered questions. The work is deliberate and ongoing, grounded in the belief that understanding emerges not all at once, but through persistence,